So much, Stefano and Terrence, for sharing that information. So we have an incredible team here tonight. We have Stefano and Terrence, as well as a number of people from the Root to Fruit team who are wrapping up their 4th year of the project. And we also have the growers that were part of that IFTA virtual tour. So I hope that you'll start putting your questions into the discussion or into the Q&A box so that we can start to have a discussion. I see a really good question. The first person that typed in the Q&A to some of the things that both of you talked about. We talk about floral initiation happening so early in Honeycrisp. And is there any reason to think that that might happen at different times based on different regions? So is floral initiation in Washington and New York happening at the same time? Does anyone want to take that question?
When the borer shoot slows down its growth and quits producing new leaves and sets what appears to be a terminal bud, that's when floral initiation starts to happen. Now, on vigorous young honeycrisp trees where those borer shoots grow longer or later in the season, then floral initiation would be slightly later. But on mature honeycrisp trees, the thing that we have seen, if you mapped every single growing point on that tree, 95% of the growing points have already stopped growing by about a week after full bloom. There's only 5% that are still growing. Those are the extension shoots, and that's what we see. But all the growing points that have stopped growing, they set a terminal bud. If the GA level at that moment is high, they don't turn floral. They just stay vegetative. And it's only when you can get floral promoting hormones at a high enough level that we can get those buds to switch to floral buds. And the point with Honeycrisp is it's a weak growing variety. So typically borer shoots stop early. And that's why. And so I would guess in Washington where trees are mature and they're weak on B9 or something, it happens the same time as in New York.
We can introduce also, we covered gibberellin, but we didn't speak a little bit about the plastocron, that is the speed of growth that when you build a node, the time in days that you need to build from one node to the next one. So when this time is the shoot is growing, normally it's 2-3 days and you build up a node. When this time gets lower and you got 5-6 days, this is where flower induction start normally. So you need, when there is a speed of growth that is reduced, this is the time where you can start to see the flower induction normally. So, and it's definitely true what Terence said. Our Honeycrisp in many times it seems really low vigor, but is really crop load dependent. So you have some tree that, for example, they seems that have no bud, and then you end up with 300 cluster, and then you got this excess of growth sometimes because the fruit is the set doesn't met normally what we want, and we saw all the kind of condition in Washington. They're Honeycrisp overgrowing and too weak. But this is the point. So if you check the speed of growth of your shoot, probably you can define when flower bud is induction start.
Terrence and Stefano, we had a poor return bloom on Honeycrisp here in Michigan. I understand in the East, a lot of people experience that. Last year, I thinned at full bloom, petal fall, 6 millimeters, 8 millimeters, 10 millimeters, and 18 millimeters. I did ATS at full bloom, and I did lime sulfur oil at full bloom. The only ones that came back with return bloom were the ones that were blossom thin. The rest were all zero. We had a heavy bloom last year.
And Philip, this is why Washington and Tori and Bruce can cover this thing much better than me. So we always see on bloom, because if you don't see on bloom, and if you come, you saw lime sulfur everywhere, because it is a standard for us. Tori, you laugh, but
so where I injured the leaves severely and the bloom, I could show you pictures if you want me to, but those came back with a nice return bloom because I injured the leaves. They had a moderate crop load, and they recovered from the injured leaves.
Phil, that early injury because of lime sulfur is not, often it doesn't affect the return bloom that badly. It is only bad for the first week or a few days after application.
So we have all these growers that have no bloom. What do you suggest they do for their trees the rest of this year and all winter and getting ready for next year?
The low crop could be because of the poor pollination in some areas. Let's remember that. Even if you have windy and the bees are not active, that makes a major difference for the scent. There are times that all conditions are ready for any apple, including Honeycrisp, to have a wonderful crop, but because of poor pollination, we may not get some.
Probably I will try to use some thinner at bloom like you did. So because otherwise they end up, they have no crop or only few flowers. So next year you saw what happens. So at least in the lower level of crop load we got here, we got 300 clusters the following year.
I also have a belief that Honeycrisp thin easy up to about 8 millimeters, and then they thin difficult. Would you agree or disagree?
I would disagree.
You would disagree?
Yes, they thin. My perception is they are difficult to thin at any stage.
Yeah, it's my
You
perception also.
need high rates and aggressive programs, whether it's bloom, petal fall.
I haven't overthinned them, but I have sure simulated them out to all kings by thinning at all bloom with NAA.
And how we make a decision on the return bloom for the following year, but also making sure that we don't oversize the fruit for the current year.
Bruce.
Yeah, we have started to aggressively utilize deficit irrigation. But that's something that Washington has. It's very easy to implement in Washington State, whereas in Michigan or in New York, some years you may be able to avail yourself of that tactic, and other years because of normal or excessive rainfall, you simply can't do it.
Are there any strategies that relate to the application of hormones, PGRs?
Some of the work that we've done in recent years, well, the last 10 years or so, working with exogenous gibberellins, GA products applied with the intention of inhibiting return bloom. And so there's a new product on the market from Fine America. It's called a range. It's primarily a GA7 is the main isomer in it. You can apply it actually right now. Kind of the optimal timing here in Washington is around 10 millimeter, but it works just fine out at 20 millimeter as well. To spray that, and that will in effect kind of mimic what might have happened if you had some of those young fruitlets that Terrence was talking about producing gibberellins in the spurs. That will take up some of that GA, and it will hopefully slow down that return bloom next year, so you don't have every growing point flowering next year, and that can help slow down the biennial bearing cycle. Like Terrence, we've done a lot of work trying to promote bloom in a heavy bloom year with NAA and Ethylene throughout the summer. We've had even far worse results than Terrence had. I think we've had one documented case of improving return bloom by spraying Ethylene through the summer out of about, let's say, 120 to 150 possible treatments. So we've had miserable success there, but we've had much better luck mitigating biennial bearing with this GA7 approach, where you spray the GA in your light crop year.
Is that a single application?
Our experience, like with many growth regulators, has been that if you can put out sequential small doses of the growth regulator, it's a little bit better. But just even one or two sprays at higher doses tends to work well too.
Have you overcooked it?
We've never pushed anything from
Non-bearing to non-bearing.
Yeah, we've never shifted that essentially the biennial bearing cycle from 1 year over, so that we had consecutive light years or consecutive heavy years. There tends to be a lot of inertia, if you will, in the trees. If they're light this year, they're going to be heavy next year. And with a really well applied GA program, we can slow that down a little bit, but no, we've never flipped it over all the way to the other side.
We've done the summer ethereal and our fruits dropped a week early, so they mature early if you have summer ethereal on Honeycrisp. Not a problem, just got to be aware of it.
So Phil, what was the date of the last summer application?
We put ethereal on the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th week after full bloom. And that affects harvest time maturity, even though that's another 6 weeks later.
Yeah, okay.
That's why we have a generalized rule of thumb that we never apply ethereal after the end of June because of that impact on early ripening. Where we never go into July with ethereal, we haven't had a problem. Now, this current idea that I've been pushing to start ethereal much earlier would put all those applications in late May and in June, with none of them in July.
I like this next
So
question.
the other thing I want to say to Tori is, I'm wondering about the timing of those ethereal sprays, 100 experiments or treatments you put out, if any of them started early, because there is a lot of talk among growers that there are some growers in Washington starting as early as 10 millimeters with ethereal because they're trying to hit this timing when we get flower initiation with Honeycrisp. Now, that seems like a reasonable strategy as long as ethereal doesn't overthin. And ethereal is a potent thinner, especially at high temperatures. Whenever temperatures are above 80 degrees, I get worried. Now, maybe in Washington, it would be difficult to find non-80 degree days to apply it. But I'm wondering about past poor experiences with ethereal being due to two things. One, the later timing after we've already missed the window. And number two, if we have an excessive number of seeds, no matter how much ethereal you put on, the GA from the seeds is there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The ethereal comes and goes, but the GA is still there and you cannot overcome it. And so if your total seed load is over some line, I just say it's like an imaginary line. If your seed load's over that, your summer sprays never work. And so there's two problems: too late of timing, I think, and too many years where the seed load is too high and we can never overcome it with summer sprays. I'm hoping this newer idea with more precision pruning and earlier sprays will help us overcome both of those problems.
Very quickly, parents, I like the direction you're headed with going earlier. We did not spray, I don't think, any earlier than maybe 28 days after full bloom was probably our earliest application. Most of them peaking around 45 days after full bloom, which is kind of the industry standard. But I'll be interested to see what you come up with your earlier sprays. And if you see something, we might revisit that idea.
Tori's suggestion is a great one. But in addition, it's next year that you really have to fight the battle. I would throw out this rule of thumb. Any grower that ends up at bloom time with more than 200 flower clusters on a Honeycrisp tree is in trouble. Any high density orchard that has 200 or 300 or 400 flower clusters, there's no way to overcome that. So you have to reduce that flower bud load through pruning. And for a tall spindle orchard where you need 100 fruits or 90 fruits, you can't be over 150 flower clusters. And when I go to orchards and I count flower clusters and there's 300 of them, I just have to shake my head and walk away and say, there's nothing I can do. You already shot yourself in the head for next year.
I have a grower turn asking about what rate, at least here in New York, we are trying to start this program and when. Perhaps next week. I don't know if you can share a little more information.
I'm suggesting that growers spray their first ethereal spray at 16 millimeters at a half pint per 100 gallons, adjusted for tree roll volume of the orchard. Once you get past 25 millimeters, I think you can raise it to a pint per 100 gallons on a tree roll volume basis. I'm also suggesting they spray on days that are under 80 degrees. So one more comment. If we could manage Honeycrisp so that every year we got about 70% of the spurs flowering, that would be ideal. Our problem is we go from years with 100% of the spurs flowering to zero. If you ever end up in a year where you got 100% of the spurs flowering, you are in deep trouble. And you have to do everything that year to give some resting spurs and get the seed load down. And so one of the things that intrigued me about this GA spray in the off year is that you can get a more 70, 60% flowering range. Every year at 60%, you have a big crop, but you never have a snowball bloom year. So somebody put in the chat box, look at the flowers behind in your background screen, Tori, and then you, Mario. That's excessive.
Right.
Completely agree. But that is sweet tango.
Oh,
So you know that.
Oh, you need all of them in this case.
Yeah.
Uh,
They fall like
yeah.
crazy.
Terence, I have a quick comment, if I may, on the number of blossoms. I agree with you, Terence, that if it is very high, we are in trouble. I sent you, probably you haven't seen that yet. I sent you a couple of slides from our experiment in Idaho that we had different times of thinning. And then it seems that one of the treatment that we had even as far as 4 weeks difference between the time of thinning, return bloom is less. We counted in 2021, but that even the return bloom is enough to get a full crop because we don't need a whole lot of flowers. I was wondering what you think about that.
I agree with that. And that's what I wish we could all move towards, is not a snowball bloom ever, just a nice bloom. Honeycrisp sets very well. If we need 70, 80, 90, 100 fruits per tree, we don't need 500 flower clusters.
The target that just Terence said is also the target that give you the best quality, the final quality, if you look at the data that I present. So if you go higher, then you get hammered by low level of dry matter. So those things are related quite well, you know.
Beautiful.
I like one question here in the Q&A. It's, can we use summer pruning or hedging to enhance return bloom?
On summer pruning, I would be a little concerned about calcium content.
I'll make a small comment. When we did summer hedging and we looked at the regrowth you get just at the 1 or 2 buds behind the cut, if it's done in June, that regrowth is about 10 centimeters. If it's done in July, it's only a few centimeters. But that regrowth often is crowned with a flower bud. And so it is possible, I think, assuming that the whole crop load level is not way too high, to get some flower buds from the regrowth from summer hedging cuts, assuming that they almost are like short spurs. They're only 2 or 3 or 4 centimeters long. All that relates to the overall balance of vigor in the tree. And John Clements asked me a question. He was just needling me. You know, I've talked about getting calm trees for 100 years now, and now I'm telling prune harder. Isn't that going against the grain? Well, the problem is with Honeycrisp, they're usually low vigor trees. So more aggressive pruning to reduce bud load generally doesn't explode vigor on Honeycrisp. It just stays calm. But just trying to manage the seed load is what we want to do. So I'm not trying to get vigor, John. I'm just trying to manage seed load.
So Terence, have you tested the new compound ACC instead of ethylene for return bloom? Apparently, ACC seems to be less aggressive than ethylene at higher temperatures.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion, Pollyanna, and we have not. But ACC is essentially a precursor to ethylene. And so in terms of return flower initiation, you know, we know cytokinin is an important hormone, but so is ethylene. And what NAA does, I believe, when we spray it, is it produces as a secondary effect ethylene. I think that's how we get the flowering out of NAA sprays. So spraying ethylene directly is a more direct way to stimulate flowering, but it's risky. So if ACC can give us that ethylene without the risk of overthinning, it might be even a better option, but I haven't tested it. So great thought, Polly.
Yeah.
Mario, very quickly, we tested ACC on Fuji, not Honeycrisp. The good thing about that is you can spray even on fruits, even at 20 millimeter or plus. It does work, but it is as Terence said, when it is way too late, I'm concerned about maturity.
So there is concern about thinning honeys with Athero. Can you decrease the rate and decrease the risk and still get the benefit? So if we're going to go with Athero on Monday, where the temperature are going to go to 90, Terence, we wait.
Absolutely.
Or we put a half pint?
Everything in life is rate dependent. So temperature just maximizes the impact from a certain rate. You reduce the rate and you get less response. And so if temperatures are high, I would say you spray, but with a lower rate. The rate I'm recommending is already a low rate, but if you cut that in half, you won't overthin.
Does anybody have a chart that attempts to relate the efficacy to the difference in temperature, say 75 degrees Fahrenheit to 85? Do I get a linear increase in thinning or do I get a logarithmic?
You get a lot. Well, I have that in my mind, Bruce, but I have never drawn it. But my experience is it's more of a logarithmic curve.
Well, that's
so
kind of my perception, but could you draw one for the next meeting?
Yeah, but if you go from
Maybe everybody
75
can
to
draw one
80,
of what they think it is.
this is my opinion. If you go from 75 to 80, it's fairly linear. When you go to 80, then it starts to go up. But when you go from 85 to 90 is when it just really shoots up, the response.
Yeah. I saw 100 one year. And then I saw a crop on the ground.
Did the drought last year have any big factor on return bloom?
So Phil, I listened to your sad story and it made me cry. That you did everything and yet many blocks came back with light bloom. We had the same problem in New York. So overall, the East Honeycrisp is off. And so I've just been scratching my head trying to come up with explanations. And the explanation I have, I would give by going back to my little slide from Martin Goffinet. So in a bore shoot, once the terminal bud sets, within that bud, you have to have 10 nodes developed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, before you can get flower buds at the tip. What I think happened last year is we had so much dry weather that the bore shoot set a terminal bud, but they didn't grow enough new nodes to ever get flower buds on the end. And that's my explanation. So remember, you have to have enough development inside that bud. Once it stopped growing, you have to have 10 more nodes developed to ever get flower buds.
So the answer is yes, the drought did have an impact.
Yes, because it came exactly at the wrong time, late May and early June.
And we had 90 degrees in bloom or petal fall last year.
Yeah.
We're going to have that again. Only we're later. We're 16 millimeters now.
So in the three different videos, we start with the crop load target from the different growers, and clearly there's a big difference between the growers in New York, in Michigan, and in Washington in terms of that target. I would like to ask the growers how they set up that target, where that number come from. Bruce, Chris.
School of University of Hard Knocks. I can't pay enough bills at 40 bins per acre. And the few times that I've had blocks at 100 plus, the crop was a disaster. Poor color, poor fruit size, no flavor, didn't store well. The fruit we picked, a lot of it was not harvested because it was essentially no color. So we've done in blocks with a really nice canopy, full canopy. We've done, 80, 85 and been pretty happy with what the fruit looked like, how it's stored, how it's packed. I wouldn't say that fruit was as good as fruit if you had a block of the same canopy volume, but let's say it was cropped at 60. I suspect that fruit would have had better color. But the 80 bins, 85 bins was commercially very acceptable.
So in summary, it's more learning curve, history of the block. So you kind of determine the potential, the maximum potential of your block.
Well, yeah, now that we've grown Honeycrisp for 20 plus years, we don't we assume that if we get a certain canopy volume, that we can get a certain amount of fruit per unit of canopy volume. And our standard canopy volume on the systems we're growing suggests that we should easily be able to do that 80 bins on a sustained basis.
Chris?
So our fruit quality, I think, is right around that 900 to 1100 bushel per acre. We've had some years where we've been 1200 bushel per acre, and it seems like we picked a lot of green fruit. You know, I'm based in that west central portion of the state. If you get up in the Traverse City area, they grow a lot nicer fruit as far as fruit color. And as you go to the southwest corner of the state, it's a little bit hotter, average about 5 degrees warmer, and they struggle with the color a little bit. So, and it really depends on what kind of year we're having during the fall, what kind of temperatures. We can have years where we have nice cool nights with really good sunny days and 75 degrees, or we can have really warm nights and cloudy weather and 80, 85, and we just don't color fruit properly. So we've got to be careful. This 2D type training system, I think, in the redder cultivars or strains is going to help us out quite a bit. So, but we got to be careful. Maybe we can move that bar up to 1,500 bushel. But right now, I feel in my orchard anyway, it's going to be about 900,000, and it just depends on the year. So we talked about NEA, and Terrence, when we use NEA during the time of thinning, we get a really nice response in the canopy, and that canopy flags. We can see that flagging. When we use summer NEA applications, and I like NEA, it's a little bit safer, and I just feel comfortable with it. But when we come in at 5 weeks, 7 weeks, 9 weeks, basically at that 10 parts per million, I do not see any flagging whatsoever. And I'm just wondering if maybe we could look at higher rates of NEA, and maybe we're just not doing enough. You got more canopy, you got more leaves in the tree, and tree volume is going to play into that. But what's your thoughts on higher rates of NEA to try and produce that ethylene? I know you've kind of mentioned it a little bit before, but just wondering what your thoughts are.
So you're right. What we see when we spray NAA during the period of time of thinning that we call flagging is an ethylene response. So it's producing ethylene that causes that leaf droopiness or flagging. The problem is that fruits themselves, the genes change, and when they pass 16 millimeters, they become very insensitive to NAA. That's why we can spray NAA pre-harvest for drop control and doesn't ever flag the trees. So higher rates don't do anything. We've tested when we first started this 5, 10, 20, and 30. And at 30 parts per million, we don't get flagging once the fruits are 25 millimeters because the trees are very insensitive to NAA once they pass 16 millimeters. That's why Etherol's always worked a little better than NAA for repeat bloom. Now, you're right. The Etherol or NAA during the thinning window does give us ethylene, and I think it's helpful. In addition, we know NAA causes some seed abortion. So NAA as a base to thin Honeycrisp at bloom and petal fall and stuff, what always tends to give us slightly lower seed count. And so I go back to this seed load. If we have poor pollination, we end up with only 5 or 6 seeds per fruit. That's good because then we won't have to battle so much seed produce GA. But years when we have perfect pollination, we have 10 seeds in every fruit and we got a lot of flowers, we're battling GA that we can't overcome with our thinning sprays. So it's just a different way to think about it. And you know, when I cut fruits at 10 millimeters, I looked at how many seeds are growing. And if there's 10 in there, and then I add up how many fruits are on that tree and multiply it by 10, I get a sense of the GA problem that I'm facing that year. And I think that's a good way for growers to start to look at it and try to think through that concept. That's one of the reasons I love blossom thinning so much, because I can knock off most of those laterals with either ATS or lime sulfur and then not have such a high seed load.
So I want to read a question that I think is really good and key to what you are saying, Terrence, here, and what you have mentioned before also on early thinning, which is crop load balancing is important to level the orchard. How do you view or manage potential set by limiting pollen source at the orchard level? Basically, what do we think about precision pollination as a strategy.
Well, I think that's very intriguing. And it's one that I think we should pursue. It's a little scary. So for example, let me throw out this idea. Let's suppose that what we really want is 5 to 6 seeds in a king flower and nothing else has a seed. We put bees in there for one day and pull them out. Now in the East, that might not work because we have 30 species of natural wild pollinator insects and bees. So they still do the work even if we pull out the honeybees. But in the past, we've wanted honeybees to pollinate every single flower and just get the maximum we can. But maybe that's not the right strategy for Honeycrisp. And maybe we should think about a different reduced pollination strategy for Honeycrisp. Now, how we get there, it's, precision pollination maybe is a really interesting concept. It's a little scary because the last thing we want to have is no pollination and all the fruit fall on the ground.
We are using, we did a nice experiment where we were using net exclusion. So we have a kind of, it's not really a drop net, it's a permanent net that you leave over the top of the orchard, and you deploy when you got a certain amount. It's like a kind of pollen tube model. So you got 100, you count 100, 120 king open, and then you deploy the net, and you have a physical barrier. And it worked quite well. So we were able to see Honeycrisp at a level that probably only the end thinning can meet this kind of things. Because the bee, also if you have natural pollinator, they cannot go there because there is a net. And then you can leave it because there's also some for sunburn protection, or you can bring it up. So, and I was using these things in Italy for many years, and we have some automatic system to deploy the net and up and down, and it was quite impressive. So, especially for organic, where we have only few options, it could be something to validate. So we got some nice result. The Gala and Honeycrisp was kind of good.
Stefano, but the king is, if you have a freezing situation, king is the first one to die.
Oh yeah.
Then
So
we are in trouble.
you
right?
need to, nothing is perfect in life, I see. So
Exactly.
you need to take your risk, as Terence said. So if it's depending what is your condition. So, and then you can adjust if you fear that you is an early season, probably you deploy the net when you got more flower open, you understand? So,
Right.
and
Can too much apogee impact the number of nodes that develop?
I want to try to comment really quick on that. One of the big disappointments in my life is that when we lost alar, which did stimulate flowering, and you're all too young to even remember that, except Bruce, you remember it. Apogee, and we thought, wonderful, they'll do the same thing as alar, but it doesn't. Because it's an anti-GA, but what it doesn't do, it doesn't allow the bud development inside that bore shoot to go to 10 nodes to get a flower bud. It stops it. And so it is bad for flowering. And so we know on pears it inhibits flowering because we don't get the bud development inside the bore shoot bud scales. And so you're right, Bobby, that too much apogee can limit flowering on apple as well.
so is true. And the apogee is working in the lower part of the chain of production of gibberelli. And another product like pacobutrazole, they're working on the top. They're stopping, they're much more effective because they are stopping, there are 100 of gibberellin that are playing a role in the tree, and probably only few people around the world know how they play. Also variety, some gibberellin can make a tree more biennial than other. So breeder need to look at that. And for sure, so what Terence say is exactly this point. So apogee is it could be a product that we can use, but have to be used in a certain way because it's not the solution of everything. So, and normally what we saw, at least on very vigorous variety, sometimes you just short the node, but you don't reduce really the node.
So Mario, quick comment on Suzanne Bishop's
Yeah.
comment that in Washington, she's seen years with 0 to 3 seeds per fruit before. That could be a result of many different things, poor pollination weather, but it could also be due to some PGR sprays. But I would guess it's more likely due to poor pollination. I don't want to have 0 fruit seeds per fruit, but what I'd love to have is 5 to 6 instead of 10.
Pretty well. We had a much better discussion than I think any of us anticipated. And so thank you everyone again for joining us.